So you want to know a little bit about Freud, eh? Let's talk about Freud. Freud was born as Sigmund Freud. I don't know, I can't speak German. We're going to call him Freud. In 1856 in Vienna. He actually thought he was his dad's twin. One of 8 kids he was the only one that actually had his own bedroom. Can we say favorites? He lived in Vienna and he wanted to avoid the Nazis, which I can appreciate that. He knew 8 languages. He was a pretty bright guy despite some of his ideas. Actually, some of his ideas are quite genius. We'll get into that a little bit, won't we? He went to medical school and became a neurologist. He actually studied the testes of eels, like the little snakes of the sea. Didn't have much luck there though. He done a lot of cocaine. He believed that it was a good anesthetic for the eye, but a lot of his patients became addicted and they died. And so he thought it wise to do a lot of cocaine himself. In fact, he done it for about 20 years. He believed in theories of cause, which I can get behind that. I think that it's rather intuitive that we have this idea of cause and effect, even psychologically. So some of the things that Freud attributed: function, structure, patterns, so on and so forth. He called them psychological causes. Probably relevant. 3 ideas behind this was the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious, which I think we've all heard about when we've seen the iceberg. Have you seen the iceberg? If you haven't seen the iceberg, Google the iceberg. It's a pretty fair representation. Basically what you have is an iceberg that's like 90 to 95% underwater, and then you have the little top sticking out the top of the water, and that represents the consciousness. And then like for the first 15 or 20 feet, let's say it's a 100-foot iceberg. And so for like the next 10 or 15 feet that's under the surface of the water, it's like the pre-conscious, right? And then everything else below that's just the unconscious stuff that you can't tap into. It's interesting because he called this the tripartite system, and that's not original. Neither is the idea that he used 3. 3, in fact, is kind of an important number in history. Anyway, the point that I'm making is he got this from the tripartite soul in Greek philosophy. Something interesting we could talk about right there. This theory became really popular, and it's based off of sexuality in Victorian England, which they were a sex-deprived bunch. What he witnessed is this idea of hysteria, and basically what happened during this time is the doctors would go around finger banging their patients until they got tired. Where do you think vibrators came from? But Freud basically believed that procreation was a sexually dominated part of our psychology, and so that's why he came up with the idea of psychosexual stages. A rather fascinating way of putting things, right? Perspective, Freud, perspective. Anyway, the first stage was the first stage was the oral stage. About the oral stage is that it really takes into consideration nourishment and so on and so forth in contact with the mother. And the idea is that if the baby didn't have sufficient contact and sufficient breastfeeding and so on with the mother, or if it was weaned too early, that the baby would basically be anxious, right, and have maladaptive coping for eternity. But really, you think about it, it's taking into consideration one's own body and one's own urges. That's why a lot of babies will suck their thumb and so on and so forth. There's 2 parts, one as the baby gets teeth and one before they get teeth. I didn't say that very well. One is pre-teeth and one is post-teeth. And the idea is that if it's before they teeth, then it has to do with oral incorporation, which they will participate, let's say. And if it's afterwards, well, then it's maladaptive. because they bite. I don't know exactly what Freud was getting at here. He essentially thinks that the kids will be sadistic. Then we have the anal stage. This is going to end up on Pornhub. The thing about the anal stage, it's interesting. I actually agree with Freud on this one, because this one is rather intuitive. If you think about it just for a second, there's a couple things about this. The elimination post being nourished. It's the proximity of sexual organs. It feels good to eliminate. God, you ever had that one poop? It seems to be memorable. It deals with privacy. It's not something that we want to show off to people. It's not like, hey, look at my new car and sorry about that, my phone SD card went full and then I had to go to class, so I wonder what Freud would say about that. So we were getting ready to talk about the phallic stage. Basically, this is where they differentiate between and recognize their erogenous zones. They understand the idea between man and woman, right? Because in this stage you have the Electra complex and the famous Oedipus complex. Just a second. It also talks about stuff about animals that we're not going to get into. I really don't want to go down that path. Basically, boys can't believe that they have a wiener. They just can't. They can't accept the fact that they got a wiener. And it's so magical that someday it's taken away, because they end up, like, if they see their mom and mom don't have a wiener, they freak clean out. This is why we have the Oedipus complex, because boys are attracted really strongly to their moms, and they seek this mother-like attention. The same is also true for little girls. They seek their paternal attention. The reason boys seek the attention, according to Freud, is because they don't want their dad to castrate them. God, I guess I would want to run from dad if I thought dad was going to cut mine off too. Around 6, kids kind of get out of this stage and it's kind of all over with, and they move on. Thank God. Next we have the latency phase. This is when, like, you're getting ready to go through puberty here pretty soon in a couple of years, because this lasts from like 6 to 11. But life becomes more adult-like in our little heads. Freud says we can differentiate between animals. But he did a lot of differentiate between animals. Essentially, this is the time frame with which we suppress our sexual proclivities. And that's off. Finally, we have the genital stage, which you would think would be the really sexual stage, but it's not. This is when there's recognition in the chemical and anatomical changes that come along with going through puberty. We all know what that smells like. Now we can redirect all that painful sexual imagery that we had previously. God, I bet that cocaine really added to that. Foreplay is all of a sudden really important to us. Foreplay. And it really comes down to the end pleasure. I guess like a Freudgasm. Why do I say these things? Freud said that masturbation didn't happen early on because people were fixated and had become rigid in their stages. That's according to Freud. As it turns out, that's not necessarily true. Even by Freud's own admittance, if we go back to specifically the anal phase, Freud talked about the erogenous zones, and this is recognized rather early. But I'm not going to get too educational and too serious into that. But this kind of concludes our little follow-up with Freud. If you'd like to know more about Freud or various other psychologists or therapists or anything about psychology, let me know. I'll try to make a video about it. I'll try to provide some explanation and insight as we walk through this wonderful, crazy world we call life. And yeah, that's about all I got.